gears. Let's talk about JD Vance. He said something quite interesting the other day. Do we have a video of that, guys, or is it just the quote here on the sheet? Oh, okay. It was a posting on X. I'll read part of it. Quote, while I'm sure the causes are complicated, no nation has leaned more into diversity as our strength. We don't need a melting pot. We have a salad bowl, immigration insanity than Canada. It has the highest foreign-born share of the population in the entire G7. End quote. Harrison, first to you. Here's my point of view. I think what we've seen in the streets of our Great Dominion, or maybe former Great Dominion, the last 2 years, has shown that official multiculturalism has been an absolute failure. We have people chanting for genocide, displaying swastikas, cosplaying as terrorists, and the political class and the police turn a blind eye, turn the other cheek, employ a deaf ear. It always was the unspoken deal. Come from wherever you are in the world. Enjoy Canada's freedoms. Enjoy our robust social programs. But here's the catch. Whatever hatred that you have in your homeland, whatever tribal grievance you have, you park that at the airport you're departing from. But that hasn't been the case. We just see silos of people that have no loyalty to Canada, no ambition to integrate. Multiculturalism has been proven a failure, I think, these last 2 years. Harrison, what say you?
It's a failure that is very hard to recover from. The problem we have now is that we've been under this assumption that official multiculturalism will be Canada's calling card, that it will be our North Star, it will lead us to greatness. We've been leading with this for decades now, to the point in which we have politicians who are representative of who represent their own silos. We have institutions in this country that represent their own silos, their own cultural silos. And this is becoming very, very hard for us to try to recover from. What's the solution here other than some very tough decisions at a political level and some brutally honest conversations that we need to have? The immigration issue, as JD Vance has pointed out, has affected our living standards. It has affected Canada's economy. It has affected our healthcare system. But it has also had a profound effect on our culture. As you pointed out, we are more divided than we've ever been. Our politics is unstable. We have foreign interference in our elections. Crime is surging, in large part due to organized foreign crime in our country and in our cities. JD Vance is right to point this out. I'm afraid it's not exactly going to help the conservative cause in our country because, as we know, when the White House gets involved and starts amplifying messages that many conservatives agree with and want to be talked about, it only ends up typically backfiring. But it is an important conversation to have nonetheless, and I'm glad someone is starting to shout it out from the highest levels of the U.S. government. Someone needs to do it.
And yet, Andy, I have no doubt that the usual suspects will brand JD Vance as a racist, as well as anyone that agrees with that. But I think it's been a failed experiment going back to the early 70s with official multiculturalism with Trudeau Sr. He was behind this. And I think we dropped the ball. I think there should have been, forgive me if I'm coming across as a bigot in the eyes of some, but a litmus test that you subscribe to Western values, that you subscribe to a democracy, that you will be a Canadian first. But that was never part of the agenda, was it?
Yeah, no, we kind of bent over backwards to make sure that that wasn't part of the agenda, actually, to make sure that we were overly accommodating, and it's kind of come back to haunt us, right? As we've seen, we've let a tremendous amount of people into this country who don't seem to be aligned with Western values, who don't, value the same things that, citizens of this country value. Unfortunately, I don't know, I don't know exactly when our immigration policy started going wrong. I mean, it seemed like we had a reasonable immigration policy. We brought in, reasonable people who were, professionals who contributed to the society, and it went well. We know around the time that, Mark Carney's friends at the Century Initiative And that was, the group that was run by, well, people who are on his staff now, and his advisors who, wanted to bring our population to 100 million. So, that initiative really seemed to coincide with the same time that immigration ramped up, and that was kind of their plan, their economic plan. And of course, we know that, you get a little bit of an artificial GDP boost when you bring in immigration, because you bring in, a few more people who are spending money. So we've kind of been artificially inflating our GDP numbers with immigration. And once we got trapped into that, it was very, very hard to come out of it, because nobody wants to say, hey, our GDP per capita really isn't doing good. When you start to cut off immigration, we're going to see like the truer, a truer representation of what our GDP actually looks like. It's not pretty. Right? We know that productivity is at probably stalled, if not maybe going into the negative growth. So yeah, I mean, unfortunate, and a lot of people are starting to put the brakes on this, not just in Canada, but all over the world. It's just too much. We've seen the awful rallies and riots in other countries. So, and our officials are starting to backtrack now on their own policies, which is good, but it's also a little bit too late. And how do we clean up the mess that we've got?
Yeah.
And we're going to have less money to do it, right? So
yeah, I'm not sure if this is a fixable problem, at least not with the Liberals in power right now. But Drea, I want to point to a follow-up tweet issued by Vice President Vance, and it's this, quote, "And with all due respect to my Canadian friends, whose politics focus obsessively on the United States, your stagnating living standards have nothing to do with Donald Trump or whatever boogeyman the CBC tells you to blame. The fault lies with your leadership, elected by you." End quote. What's your take on that statement, Drea?
Well, that is absolutely 100% true. I don't know how we elected a Liberal government for the fourth time, but at the same time, I do, because right when it needed to happen, the perfect ammo was put in place. And so if you look a little lower down and you see Alex Zoltan with Juno, his comment is kind of on point. He says, well, I agree with you. The whole 51st state thing and how hard the US went on Canada and when they went on Canada, the timing of that did have an impact on why Canadians felt they needed to go against the big bad orange man. And the CBC did exactly what we knew it would do should a situation like that arise. So, of course, that's not entirely on the US, but it is something to be said.
And, perfect segue into our next item, guys, speaking of the CBC, because CBC News reports undoubtedly gleefully, Canadians are shunning U.S. travel and reaping the rewards. Harrison, back in July, I had to go to Southern California because of a wedding, and it was a pricey part of California, but you add in the fact that you're taking a 40% haircut in terms of where the Canadian dollar is. It was extraordinarily expensive. Could that be the reason why so many Canadians are shunning travel to the U.S.? That has nothing to do with the tariff tiff or Donald Trump, but you are getting smacked big time in the exchange rate.
I think that's obviously a factor, and I think that's a factor whenever Canadians are traveling, and it's a factor for everyone who travels, because if you don't have money that supports what you're trying to do, then it becomes difficult, and the Canadian dollar is struggling right now. I do want to go back to the JD Vance comment about declining living standards, and I think broadly, of course, he is right to point out that the problems rest with the Canadian government, and the responsibility should be held by the Canadian government. But I think if you were to ask certain lumber workers and auto workers right now, they might have a completely different answer, because those industries, to be totally honest, have been destroyed by the tariffs and the tariff war. So there are certainly people that are struggling, I think, in large part due to the fact that we do have this trade war going on. And I think the commenter was right to point out that if that's the case and that's the way JD Vance feels, well, they should stop talking about Canada so much and stop making it some sort of foreign policy objective, even if it seems to be a joke. Whatever the case is, my feeling is that the election we just had was heavily interfered with by the United States. And if they were trying to orchestrate an outcome in Canada that would see the Liberals win, they achieved it perfectly. I don't have any evidence to back this up, but I am convinced that there was an interference operation or objective to engineer an outcome which they got and the one they wanted.
Yeah, it is a bit of a mystery to me, given the political alignment that Trump wasn't simpatico with Pierre Poilievre. But Andy, going back to what we discussed earlier, and Harrison dabbled into it. Prime Minister Carney was supposed to rescue Canada. I guess, granted, he never gave a timeline, but it has been 7 or 8 months. There's no great deal. Here's some ominous news. Mexico has jumped past Canada to be the U.S.'s top customer. I don't ever remember that in my lifetime. So my personal feeling, and somebody might call me a conspiracy nut, but I really think Brookfield Asset Management and its $1 trillion worth of assets, they're really running Canada, and they are heavily invested in the U.S. Mark Carney has a personal blind trust. The lion's share, I understand, are U.S. businesses. So when you think about it, why would Carney want Canada to succeed and the U.S. not to? That's not good for business.
No, I mean, we know that Brookfield's heavily invested in the United States. They've got new projects, they've got new, fossil fuel projects, oil and gas projects going on, pipelines. So it's really not in Carney's best interest that he retaliates against the United States heavily, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's just common sense. If you have a blind trust where you've got vested interests in Brookfield, and Brookfield is doing most of their business right now with the states and overseas and not in Canada, then it's just not in your own personal best interest to retaliate too hard against the United States. And I think that this is where Trump really has Carney, is that he's got these dual interests, right? Of course he's the Prime Minister of Canada, but he is also the head of a multinational corporation that has serious interests in United States assets and things like that. So I think that they're aware that Carney is in this situation.
Yeah,
and they're playing him up for it, right? Understanding that he doesn't really want to destroy those sectors, right? And why would he? Because he's invested in those sectors personally. And so this is this problem with Carney being the prime minister, is when you've got that sort of a portfolio where you've got conflicts of interest everywhere. How do you balance your position, which is to do the right thing for Canada and Canadians, versus your own personal interests? So yeah, but I mean, I think Vance mostly called it like it is. We are kind of masters of our own fate, and we've certainly are responsible for a lot of the decline in our standards of living. Although, yeah, Harrison's correct as well. The tariffs certainly aren't helping. And so what are we going to do now? Well, I mean, it looks like we're going to start, pulling closer to Europe and Middle Eastern countries, like, of course, the UAE, right? As I pointed out a couple of days ago, Mark Carney's latest trip to the UAE to sign investment pacts followed hot on the heels of his old colleague, Bruce Flatt, who is CEO of Brookfield. So Brookfield was just there meeting with the same officials 6 days before Mark Carney touched down and announced $70 billion, I believe, that they're going to invest in us, was the pledge. Whatever that means, right? They run around making these pledges all the time, and whether this is actually going to materialize or not. But I do think it's fascinating that Brookfield does seem to be preceding some of these trips, and maybe forging some of those relationships ahead of Mark Carney arrival in the country. You know, maybe making sure that there's some understanding ahead of his visit, and then he just kind of has to show up and say, yeah, okay, we'll seal the deal.